In response to the lack of specific data about ethnic minority groups in environmentalism, Zarina is now researching sustainable behaviours with BAME communities in the UK for a PhD. Zarina has worked hard to diversify the environmental sector. She led a climate change funded project working in partnership with Keep Scotland Beautiful, developing over 150 ethnic minority-led climate challenge funded projects across Scotland. She sits on a number of boards, including Friends of the Earth Scotland, and is an experienced trainer covering topics of climate change and equalities. In her free time, she has much of that. She does lots of charity work, including co-founding a charity called Caring Scots, which works with homeless people and refugees in Scotland and abroad. In recognition of this broad work, Zarina was named one of the top 30 influential women in environment by BBC's Women Hour, and recognised by Edinburgh Science Institute as an inspirational woman who has made a significant impact in science, technology, engineering and maths. We're very pleased to have Zarina with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We have Alistair McIntosh, also based in Glasgow. Zarina is based in Glasgow. Alistair is an environmental campaigner, author, lecturer, founding trustee of the Gillian Trust, and an honorary professor in College of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow. This is only a snapshot. He's also a Glasgow Quaker with an interfaith outlook. His work is focused around spirituality and its practical implications for the world around us. Perhaps his most famous book is Soil and Soul, through stories of his growing up in Lewis, land reform on the Isle of Egg, and the campaign that stopped the Harris Super Quarry. He expresses the deeper stories of our time, the struggle of human spirit to shine, the imperative of making community, the recovery of credible spirituality. His most recent book, Riders of the Storm, is an up-to-date summary in plain language of the consensus on science of climate change. He also looked into the psychology of both denial and alarmism and rounds on what it is the world can do. Rounds on climate change as a call to deepen in our spirituality and relationships and community with others. It speaks to the human condition in visceral terms that might speak to each one of us today. John Slowe is a founding director of a research consultancy business called Delta EE. The EE stands for Earth and Environment. Through his work, he supports companies working in the broad energy industry to shift their businesses away from old fossil energy and towards our much needed zero carbon future. The work at Delta EE is accelerating the pace at which our energy system can become zero carbon through low carbon heating, transport, and supporting more renewable electricity. John is host of Delta EE's Talking New Energy podcast, now into series 11. On the podcast, he hosts a selection of guests from across the new energy industry. He's considered a thought leader in the big challenges of decarbonising the energy sector. So these are our speakers joining us in person today. We hope that they will each bring their backgrounds into their reflections on some of our panels. On Zoom, we are joined by Lindsey Fielder-Cook. Lindsey works at the Quaker United Nations Office, where she focuses on climate change and environmental degradation as a peace and justice concern. Through her work, she engages at an international level with the climate change negotiations, climate science, and human rights efforts, while seeking to connect international progress with grassroots efforts. QNO's approach of quiet diplomacy helps UN diplomats, staff, and non-governmental partners to do important work on difficult issues in a quiet, off-the-record atmosphere out of the public eye. Lindsey has published How to be a Hero for All of Our Children, a People's Climate Toolkit. It aims to be an accessible resource for local communities, which explains cutting-edge climate science from the latest reports of the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and links it to suggestions for personal actions and questions for politicians. Our final speaker, who won't be joining us in person, but has contributed, is Gillian McFarland. Gillian is a visual artist whose work explores connections between knowing and not knowing, often working with scientists and other artists on environmental issues. She's based in Fife. Gillian is co-founder of Harbour, a visual arts project that offers a considered pause, allowing for reflection on this moment in time, whilst also looking back and considering the future. It's an interdisciplinary collaboration comprising artists, researchers, academics, focusing on archiving. So that's an insight into who our speakers are this evening. And I will shortly ask them each to speak to, we've asked them to choose 2 panels which they will speak to this evening and talk about their reflections on the panels. And then we will have time for discussion. We'll have a go through of them all talking about a panel, then we'll have some time for discussion, then they'll talk about another panel, and then we'll have a longer time for discussion. So as I say, if you're on Zoom at home, please do use the chat to be able to raise your questions and your comments. And before we invite the speakers here, so Gillian wasn't able to attend in person, so she has recorded her contribution. It's a bit about her and reflections on the project, and then some reflections on her 2 panels. So for technical reasons, we're going to try and show all of her contribution first, and then we'll come to our speakers. So hopefully Matt is able to share that and the technical wizardry will work.
Can you all see that all right?
You can see it? Yes.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, let's try.
Hello, I'm Gillian McFarland. I'm an artist, co-lead on a project called Harbour. I'm also an art therapist, and I have to say thank you very much for inviting me along to contribute to this project. I'm so sorry I haven't been able to make it, despite my best attempts, with you tonight. But here is my selection of panels for you. Firstly, I'd also like to say, or secondly, that this is a beautiful project. And I found wandering through it, it's given me such hope and joy. The fellowship stitched together in the making of these panels is evident. Rich and diverse in their imagery, these panels have a shared concern for the world we love. We really must wake up to the wonder of our world and the impact of humanity's careless living practices. To choose 2 panels from the greatness of this whole has been an almost impossible task. I find myself putting it off and instead wander back again through the offerings with a sense of joy and sorrow. The intent of stitching brings to my mind the hope of repair, of giving attention to the mending, of creating these textures of care. These panels offer us the opportunity to dwell on the possibilities, on building individual and collective agency when we feel most helpless, that small acts matter in seeding hope. Pushed by time to make a choice, and it really could have been any of these wonderful artworks, I will take number 136, the Australian camel. I find this image very arresting and compelling, its sense of being out of the ordinary, a man-made situation with heartbreaking outcomes. We have tampered with our natural world in a way no other species has. I feel I stand looking here at a displaced animal. It gives me such a sense of distress. I feel accused. What have we allowed to happen? My second choice has to be 2045, animals, for its use of natural materials in relation to our current COVID pandemic. This passing year has shown us we can make the changes when we want to. We can work together, and nature is still there when we have the time to look, think, and listen. I love the simple, bold placement of the materials in this work, the way the mask placed into the frame acts to filter out the pollution of the transport images. I am also intrigued that it is called animals when there are none placed within the image. I begin to sense that we, humanity, are the animals in the abusive sense of the word, humanity thoughtlessly destructive on this beautiful ecosystem.
We weren't able to see the panels that she was talking about, but I will just share my screen and I will flash those up for a moment. So it's the beautiful Australian camel, so out of the ordinary.
With heartbreaking outcomes. My second choice has to be 2045, animals, for its use of natural materials in relation to our current COVID pandemic. This passing year has shown us we can make the changes when we want to. We can work together, and nature is still there when we have the time to look, think and listen. I love the simple, bold placement of the materials in this work, the way the mask placed into the frame acts to filter out the pollution of the transport images. I am also intrigued that it is called animals when there are none placed within the image. I begin to sense that we, humanity...
Okay, that's the most technically difficult part of the evening, and hopefully the screen share will be able to keep up with what we want to talk about. But going to our panelists who are here with us this evening, the first one we're going to pick up with is Lindsey, who is on Zoom, and she will talk to this panel about donut economics.
Thank you all. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Wonderful. Greetings from actually Newcastle at the moment, and thank you for this invitation. And the first of the panels that I chose is called Fresh Thinking, Donut Economics. And I chose this one to reflect one of two words that come to me about what I'd like to share tonight. The first is transformation, the second is resilience. And I chose the donut economics because of transformation. This image is actually based on something called the 9 planetary boundaries, which was created by the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And it was the first piece of research I did with my graduate work on climate change. And what was so moving about the 9 planetary boundaries is that it showed how interconnected the environmental stress on our planet is. So it's not only climate change, it's also land change, it's fresh water, it's chemical pollution, it's ozone, and ocean acidification. And those red pieces coming out in the original planetary boundaries, the biggest red pieces are not actually climate change. They are biodiversity or extinction of species at a rate unprecedented in our human history. And the other is the rate of chemical pollution. And climate change is growing, but we're not yet at that level. So it's a reminder of a number of things. One, how interconnected nature is. And the other, how actually there are other great stresses happening right before us, and that they're each a symptom. So climate change we talk about as a symptom of a greater challenge. How then to live sustainably and justly on Earth. And while, as people have already mentioned, it can feel scary, this also gives me hope. And what our panel has done in making this is she's taken Kate Ratworth is an economist who then used these boundaries and created what she called a safe space for humanity, for her donut economics. And so she takes this and says, look, with these, what do we need to make that safe space? How can we transform? Because the root causes driving climate change are also driving, many of them are very shared root causes driving the other. So I love this image. It looks quite stark, but I love what she is also saying as an economist, and she, in the sense of a sustainable and just economic system, a place in which we look not only at the economics, but we prioritize our food, our health, our water, our education, our gender equality, our social equity, and our income, and bringing them all together and calling what she says is a safe space for humanity. So I use that as a focus first on the need to transform in order to heal these red spaces. Thank you.
Our next panel, once this updates, is one chosen by John. Hopefully it will be here.
I can see it on the screen.
You can start to speak to
Sorry, I
him.
couldn't
You're
start.
okay.
So this is one called Hope. And actually seeing some of the panels behind me in person today has doubled the experience I've got in looking through all the panels. I looked at and read every single one on the website. They were absolutely amazing. And seeing them today, you get an idea of the texture, the beauty, the contrast between them even more. So as I think other people have said, it's an impossible choice. But I like this panel because of that word hope. I think there's a lot of, someone said earlier, I think it might be you, Linda, it can be overwhelming thinking about climate change, what humans are doing to the earth. And it is, and we need to feel that and understand that and be overwhelmed, I think. But there is a huge amount we can all do. And the word hope, but also the imagery in this, I found uplifting, the sense of people flowing upwards towards the earth. It's hard to put it into exact words, but the combination of things on this panel, I found incredibly uplifting, and the stories in it is uplifting as well. It mirrors my story a bit, where I've got to know people in my community, and I've spent a lot more time in my local area appreciating things I rushed past before. So I love the hope, and in the field I work in energy, you'll have all heard in the news the gas price crisis at the moment, but I think that what isn't talked about in the news is hope and the things that we can all do. So that, I think, is a big disconnect actually between what most people understand about energy and wanting to do the right thing but not being able to do the right thing. So my hope in energy is that people can start understanding more and more, and the energy industry can start explaining to people more and more what they can do, what changes they make, and we can feel empowered to do things in energy, in wildlife, in parks, whatever, that feel we're doing our bit and living true to our own values.
Thanks, John. Our next panel is one chosen by Zarina, which we'll update in a moment.
Just waiting for it to come up, and as soon as it comes up, it's a panel about peace. Is that right? What I'm talking about? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this one really stood out for me, and I struggle to find peace in this panel, even though the panel was talking about peace, because what I saw in this panel was there was lots going on in the panel. I mean, so we've got it spoke to me more about energy rather than peace. We've got the windmills, the wind turbines, we've got the solar power from the sun, we've got the marine life, we've got the trees in the background. And for me, I was trying to find peace in here. And at the same time, when I was looking at this, and I had this despair of, are we destroying the planet? What are we doing to the planet? Is this what peace is going to look like? You know, and for me, I think the positive of this picture was it showed us that we actually, this is where we belong. We belong to the earth. We belong to the planet. We're part of one ecosystem. But yet at the same time, we're so far removed from it. And I think peace part I struggled with, and I think that was why I was attracted to it, because I was thinking, where is my peace in this picture? How do I find peace among so much that's going on? That for me is like, yes, there's hope, there's solutions here, but at the same time, are we actually going the right way? Are we actually connected to the planet? Are we actually connected to each other? And one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating by the panel, by the panels themselves, is the interconnection between the crises, the interconnection between the solutions, the interconnection between people and the interconnection between us and the planet. And I thought the panels themselves say volumes, and each picture has its own message. And again, for me, I look at this one and I think someone in here, the person behind this, actually found their piece in this, but yet I'm struggling to find my piece in this picture. But again, it shows that we are all so different, and our vision of what peace looks like is different. And how do we get to that vision where we can all live in harmony?
And finally, for this section, we are going to hear from Alistair.
Hello, everybody. Forgive me having these captions on your screens. If you're watching at home, you can turn them off if you go into the CC and turn it off if it's annoying to you, but I'm very deaf, so that helps me to pick up what people are saying. So I've chosen for my first panel an image that also speaks, like Zarina was speaking about, to the difficulty of finding peace, and yet also perhaps pointing to the way forward in it. It's a heart connected to the roots of life, represented by the spiral. And the artist who has created this notes that the heart is imperfectly stitched, and yet she or he says that they like it that way. There you can see the second paragraph. I saw a white heart that is improperly sewn, but I like that. And then further down, it is about connecting and a positive flow of energy that brings joy and happiness to the planet Earth. So what I've got very much in my mind these days, and especially what came through in writing Riders on the Stone, is what I think of as being the 4 C's. And the first 3 C's are about what's wrong with the situation in the world we're in. And the final one is about how we put it right. I'll speak to the first 2 now, and in the second panel, I'll speak to the other 2. The total of them are clearance, collapse, consumption, and community. So using this panel, let me speak to clearance and collapse. By clearance, I mean something that remains very historically vivid here in Scotland, because it was continuing into just a century before I was born, namely the Highland clearances, the evictions of people from the land. And what we see so clearly in the Scottish situation is something that also happened in other parts of Europe. In England, it was called the enclosures. It happened all over the place, that movement of moving people off the land. And the artist here, if you look at the first paragraph, talks about how to protect nature and yourself as part of nature as well, and then says, I know that capitalism destroys human and other nature. So awareness of this is very important. And my appeal is that we understand exactly what it is that that spirit of capitalism does to us. And that is why open my mind is so important. In the context of our alienation, not just from the land, but also the profound connections to one another in community that you get in communities of place, that you get in geographical communities. That was driven by turning the land into a commodity. That was driven by making land something that could be bought and sold, and the tenants kicked out. So in Scotland, we had the Highland and the Lowland clearances, you had the enclosures in England, and so on. And where did those people go? They went off to places like America. So if you take Donald Trump, 2 of his maternal ancestors were evicted from the land, and that set in course a train of action by which Mary Ann MacLeod emigrated to America and raised Donald Trump in a context where he was no longer held in the basket of the community. So that is clearance. And my suggestion is that when that basket of the community starts to be shattered as a result of people being commoditized like this leads to a kind of psychological collapse. And we're not aware of it because it gets passed on intergenerationally. These things were often not talked about. They weren't passed down because families were ashamed of them. But we see it very clearly in Native American communities. We see it very clearly now that Highlands and Islands communities in Scotland are waking up to it. So I leave you with this image just now of an imperfectly sewn heart. That there is an attempt to connect with the source of life in this image, and yet something is damaged in that course. We are wounded. And the question that I will turn to with the next slide is whether we can take that woundedness and turn it into the role of the wounded healer in our world today.
Thank you, Alistair. So a moment now to see if we have any reflections so far. I'll ask to Matt if there are any questions coming through on the chat. But first, are there any comments in the room here? Linda has one.
Perhaps I could ask John about the energy, and you talked about the energy crisis and so on, and of course, and the gas thing. It's about creating energy, but it's also about using it and not using it. And one of our panel makers was emailed me actually yesterday. She's in France, and we were talking about something else, but she wanted me to know that she had just heard that the French government was going to pay for her whole house to be insulated, for a new heat pump to be installed and the old gas boiler taken away. Do you think there's any prospect of that happening in this country?
In different ways, probably, but I hope so. So you and your French friend absolutely right that the discussion so far in the media has focused on the price of gas and can't it be cheaper because we want to use gas. And the price of gas is having terrible effects on people having to choose between heating or eating. But quite rightly, what we should be focusing on is, well, what we pay for energy is a function of how much the unit of energy costs and how much we use. So the discussion should be about how can we better manage what we use. And if we're using energy more efficiently, if we're even generating it ourselves, storing it ourselves, then the effect of price changes becomes much, much smaller. And the UK government, the Scottish government, I think, are grappling with how to do the sorts of things that are going on in France. So there are questions about the amount of money, because if you take 20 odd million households and £10,000 per household, that's a lot of money. So who pays for that? Is it energy payers? Is it taxpayer? How to do that equitably? Do you pay for the whole lot, or do you pay for part of it? But there are different ways that can be done as well. So maybe rather than buying a heat pump, you pay for keeping your house warm, and someone else invests in that heat pump in your home. So there's a huge range of possibilities. My concern is that there's a massive lack of urgency and oomph to do something about it. And the UK government's been looking at the question of heating our homes for the last 10 years and made about that much progress. Maybe a little bit more, I don't know. But it's inching along, and we need to be sprinting along. So it's brilliant to hear about your friend in France. I don't see the sprint yet in the UK, but hopefully this will spur a bit more energy, so to speak, into the issue.
Can I ask a follow-up? Just What do you think people can do to help that happen? Because this is all about us all taking, what can we do to make that happen?
So there are big steps and there are small steps, but the small steps, for example, when you walk into your house, you don't have one switch to switch all the lights on in your house. You have individual switches in each room. But the way our heating is controlled, most of us effectively have one switch for all of the heating of our house. So it's a big job to change that system, but most people have these valves on their radiators, and you can manually make sure the valve's off in the sitting room until you want to be in the sitting room. And maybe I'm only in my sitting room in the evening, so switch those valves off until late afternoon. It's a bit of a faff to walk around and change it, but it's not too much of a faff. You can even buy valves that have timers on them, so you can set the valves to be at different temperatures at different times. So then automatically, if you don't want the faff, you can have your rooms heated to different temperatures at different times. So that's one very simple thing. Another one could be just, you might have a smart meter, you might have a dumb meter, but it's really difficult to get an idea of how much energy you're using for heating. So simply writing down how much you're using every day, looking at the meter, again, a bit of a faff, it's not a smart meter, but that connects you with, okay, this is what heating my home actually involves. So those are just a couple of small steps that I think people can do.
I feel that sort of there was a bit of leading into the next slide. So I wonder if we'll invite you to talk to your next slides just now, and then we'll have a bit more time for discussion at the end. Change sharing this screen.
Are we getting any comments on the chat? We can encourage people to do that.
We have one which I can read if you'd like.
Yes, that would be great while I'm trying to work out the technical.
Yeah, sure. Okay. It's from Nancy. She says, sorry, I'm crying now because I'm of Scottish and Native American descent, and Alistair speaks to my condition. The idea of the wounded healer is resonating with me very strongly, and I look forward to hearing more about the history of the clearances and how to transform those generational wounds into positive action.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. I'm hoping that again the slides will catch up. But the next slide we're going to hear from, the next panel we'll hear from is John talking to this panel.
Thanks, Ricky. This struck me because I've been lucky enough to go to Zimbabwe. I should add, it was 25 years ago when I wasn't even thinking about the carbon emissions of flying to Zimbabwe. But when I was in, my memories of Zimbabwe are a mixture of the beauty of the country and the beauty of the people, and the positiveness and the energy of the people I met there. And this panel talks about the impact of climate change in somewhere like Zimbabwe. And I think the impact of climate change here will be bad, but we're a relatively rich country and we'll manage to adapt. But in Zimbabwe, both the impact on people, I think, will be much more severe than the impact on people here. And Zimbabwe still has a lot of its original wildlife nature that we don't have in this country. And I think we'll see the impact of climate change on nature and the earth in Zimbabwe in ways that we don't see it here. So for me, it was more awareness of the impacts of climate change around the world. And I love the positivity that this person is finding ways to get involved in supporting people in Zimbabwe from, I'm guessing, the UK or North America or Europe. So brought out to me the global aspect of climate change and what we can do here where we live, but what we can do beyond that as well.
The next panel we will move to is Lindsey's second panel.
Hello, and I've just, if you go to the bottom of the word, sorry, I've missed seeing all of you, and I'm just going to side by side, see if I can see you all again. There you are. Okay, thank you. This panel spoke to me, both the picture, but it was the title. And with this, please take me home, I want to uphold the word resilience. So the first was transformation and the second is resilience. And I chose this title, it just pulled out to me. I appreciate that the panel is about reducing consumption, effective recycling, ensuring that our garbage is dealt with healthily and picking it up. In fact, that the garbage actually is dealt with in country and not shipped to poorer lands to be dumped. But I chose this panel because it said, please take me home. And that was a spiritual message that just hit me, I think, as our friend in the chat box, who also talked about crying, there was just this sense of, for many of us, our lives are so disconnected from what sustains us. And that could be the physical, the land, the spiritual, the family, the community, the home. And we live in this sort of infinite email, paper, opinions to read, infinite space of internet where it's all on a screen in the air and we're getting lost. And I took this, please take me home, in a sense of, how does disconnection relate to our current human state and how we are destroying nature in a way that's both knowing and in denial and just blinding ourselves. And we're in a situation where the changes are happening almost too fast to adapt, not just the physical changes, but also the changes within information, within speed, within what's happening. And of course, around us, particularly with our youth, we have this sense of anxiety and doom and environmental anxiety and talks of climate emergency. And how are we upholding our youth? And how are we giving them witness that we are part of the change? So I take this panel to speak of, please take me home, take me to my heart, take me to my soul, take me to my community where there is resilience and hope and vision, take me to a physical connection with my neighbor. So both panels, the transformation and the resilience to build a healthier world, because how we live now in terms of the way we are living unsustainably is not an option for the future. We have to change to build that future. And that can be exciting when it's done with the sustainable and just and the healthy side, when it's done with equity, when it's done with caring for people and nature, and not when it's done through what we're seeing. And we've already talked about capitalism, we've talked about corporate, we've talked about energy system, who owns the energy, who's making money off it. So these questions we want to ask ourselves is, what is the system around us and how does that need to change? While within us, we have our personal witness, we have the actions within our lives that empower us, but we also engage politically. We need to change what is holding us into this system. And just to finish, we need everyone, however gray or gone our hair, to believe that better is possible, to believe in ourselves, to believe in communal action, and to believe in the common good and to uphold the common good. As the economist who did the donut economics, Kate Raworth, said, a safe space for nature and humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsey. So the next panel, Zarina, you would talk to this.
Yeah, so the next one for me was about food, and hopefully the picture will come up in a minute. And it was actually, I think Alistair spoke a lot about why I've actually picked food, because food for me is at the heart of everything. And when I say everything, I mean the climate crisis, I mean our political system, our capitalistic system, and us being, as human beings, food connects. Food connects. We are alive because we eat. We need food. However, food became a commodity. And when food became a commodity, that's when, for me, the issues arose. Food is, now we talk about food waste, we talk about food banks, we talk about food poverty, not having enough food, there's not enough food for the world. I don't believe any of that. I think it's the wrong way to treat our relationship with food. Similar to what Alistair was saying, food is part of my heritage. And it saddens me to see what capitalism and colonialism has actually done to my heritage. I come from a background of farmers who actually grew food for the people to eat and to share and to connect, not food to sell, not food to make money, not food for big businesses. So food should be taken back. Again, it's become a system. Food is a food system now. When did food become a system? You know, for me, food is not that. Food is a lot more. Even like the food that we have in hospitals, it's awful because it's the nature and the relationship that we've created with food. So food and hospital schools is all about a budget and what that food can do. And it's about enough, just enough, rather than that nurturing, nourishing relationships that we have with food. And for the communities that I belong to, food is at the heart of connecting with one another. You share your food, you eat together, your food is a way of showing love and gratitude. Yet, at the same time, food is this commodity that we now waste so much in the West, and corporations waste so much food, and yet we have this whole lot of people in society that have no food. What kind of world are we living in? For me, it's like we need to take back that relationship with food, take it away from being a food system, take it away from being a food commodity, and actually realize the value and nurturing and the love that food brings to us and to the planet. Because if we treat food in a different relationship, we're actually talking about how do we nurture our food and our food systems for us and for the planet, rather than treating it as an exploitation and extraction. So so I think food is a double-edged issue when it comes to the climate crisis. On one hand, it is causing climate crisis. On the other hand, it's going to be impacted, but on a third hand, it actually can be a part of the solution. Yeah.
Final panel before we go into our discussion. Back to you, Alistair.
So what we just heard Zarina talking about there was a commoditization of food, which follows from the commoditization of land. And I was talking about clearance leading to a psychological, an intergenerational psychological collapse, where we don't know what it is we've lost. It's so interesting looking or listening to old Hebrideans speaking, because I was raised on the Isle of Lewis, where my father was a doctor in the community. And when you hear the old people speak, and indeed when I think back to childhood, how it was then, much of our food was not commoditized. Much of our food was on systems of mutuality and reciprocity. I would go fishing, somebody else would give me a leg of lamb, that kind of thing. My father rarely didn't come back with a clutch of eggs or a lobster or a bit of fish or something like that when he'd be out visiting his patients. That was food in a context of reciprocity, where it was tied in with human relationships. You have clearance, you have collapse, you have the collapse of ways of doing and being, ways of seeing, being and doing. You have the collapse of that, which then gets normalized. For Donald Trump in his world, it's not the Hebridean way of reciprocity, but a dog-eat-dog world that has been normalized. Clearance collapse. And that brings me on to the next two of consumption and then finally community. So consumption is what comes about, not just consumption in the legitimate sense. We are all consumers, obviously, we all eat and drink and what have you, but specifically consumerism as consumption in excess of what is needed for a dignified sufficiency of life. And here our Quaker testimonies of simple living are so important, because those testimonies are about dignified sufficiency of life, living simply so that all are able to live. So clearance, collapse, consumption, we don't realize how vulnerable we have become to the blandishments of consumerism, to the whole advertising world. I was commenting the other day on so-called fatigued clothing. I hope I'm not going to embarrass anybody in this room. By fatigued clothing, I mean, the kind of jeans that have holes ripped in them. And just wondering, do the people who buy these things, do they ever think of the poor people in Chinese sweatshops who are scrubbing away with sandpaper to make it look ragged, to make poverty a fashion statement? Do they ever think about the ecological cost of the cotton that has gone into that? Or are we, as a culture, so damaged in our capacity to respond to the earth and one another with empathy that we don't realize? And in this panel here, the caption has it, "Wear it as long as thou canst." So that was what George Fox said to William Penn. When George Fox said to Penn, "I see you are still wearing a sword." And Penn said, "Yes, but I'm not sure if I should be now that I've become a Quaker." Fox didn't tell him to go away and give it up. Fox said, "Wear it as long as thou canst." In other words, wait until it sickens you. Or when you can no longer feel you can justify carrying the sword, that's the time when you lay it down. You don't lay it down prematurely before you're ready to, otherwise you'll create a counter reaction in your own unconscious. You'll only be doing that for show. You lay it down when you can no longer. And so it is with consumerism. The more we become aware, remember my first panel there was about open my mind. The more we open our minds, the more we become aware of how we are relating in the world. In other words, don't repress ourselves. If we repress ourselves, we just hide it from ourselves. We tell a lie to ourselves. But do what we do with awareness. And the more we become aware, we may reach the point where we have worn it as long as we canst. But what then? If we reach that point of saying we're no longer going to get our kicks from consumerism, because that's what's filling the emptiness, that's a collapse resulting from clearance not just from the land, but from our social relationships has brought about. We could be in a very lonely place. We could be in a place that traditional mystics call the dark night of the soul, where you've kind of seen through the vanities of worldly living. And yet the full spiritual shebang has not yet opened up to you. So you're in a place of what George Fox called an ocean of darkness. And what he called the ocean of light has not yet opened up to you. And this is where our community is so important. This is where a sense of understanding community as being about profound spiritual connection to one another becomes so important. Because I believe the deepest antidote to where we are at in the world just now is we need to reconstitute community. We need to rebuild our relationships with one another and understand that as the Quaker movement at its deepest understands it, as not being about the I, the kind of ministry that begins, I think that. It's not about the I. It's not even about the we. we as a meeting for worship for business think that. But it's about listening to the deep spirit that gives life. It's about connecting in with that deep spirit and understanding that that is the root of what gives life. Jesus used the metaphor of the vine of life. And in Scotland, we have wonderful examples of that happening. Some 3% of Scottish land now in community ownership, some 500 community land trusts. I was astonished yesterday to see a photograph from the Golson Trust. And folks, you will know how difficult it can be in some professional contexts to find a woman speaker on a particular subject. Let me tell you that when it comes to land reform, it's the other way around. There are many wonderful, you know what I'm talking about, John, you've seen it yourself. The picture I saw yesterday from Golson Trust with about a dozen women involved in running this trust and one token man in the photograph. And what's going on there? What's going on there? That when we start to shift to an ethos of doing things, as you would see on the Isle of Lewis all the time, for the community. It's not about the me, it's not about even the we in the now sense, it's for the community of the whole, the community of membership one of another. When we start coming from that place, very deep flows of life opened up, the kind of flows of life that do not fit in well with egotism, do not fit in well with narcissism, but do fit in well with leadership as service. And I think that's why we see so many, it was the same on egg, it was largely women who led the egg land reform. I think that's why we're seeing this gendered dynamic going on that Community Land Scotland is currently making a study of. So clearance, collapse, consumption, and the imperative of rebuilding community. Notice in this panel here, even as I stitch, I'm aware of the rivers diverted and piped in cotton production, the stories of cruelty in mass sheep shearings, the dead worms who produced these beautiful scraps of silk. What I love about that paragraph is this artist's acknowledgement of complicity. So often we are pointing the finger out there. We're saying it's a capitalist, it's a government, and we're not owning that we are part of the systems that are causing these things on us. And there you see beautiful ownership of it. And from that ownership, from that open my mind, that first panel, deeper roots of life can flow in. And that is the only deep hope I see with climate change, because politics, economics, and technology alone are not going to be enough.
Alistair and all of you.
Can I add something? Because what Alistair,
yeah,
because something that Alistair said just actually came to my mind was the term Ubuntu. Many people might have heard of that term Ubuntu, which is I am because you are.
Exactly.
And for me, that is the essence of us human beings. And if we can just recapture that and get that back, because it's moving away from the I, it's moving away from the ego, and it's more about we're all part of the same, we're all connected, we're all that what I do has an impact on you, what you do has an impact on somebody else. However, I always have a however, I see the word and I can't see that. I don't see that happening. Instead, I see more and more divisions happening in the world. I see more and more wars happening. I see more and more divides happening. Even here, during the pandemic, there is this whole language and narrative around the othering. You know, it was somebody else's fault. They're the ones to blame. And you know, and it's about we're in it together. We're not in it together. We might be in the same sea together, but we're definitely not on the same boat together. And I think it's how do we be together? How do we come together? How do we become united and work towards a peaceful and unity? And unity with each and one of us, and also with the plan. That's my question to everyone. It's a big question, and I just it's always just set in my head. How do we get together?
One example of the first panel that I chose, in it, the person talked about they walk in the park and they bought a litter picker and they started on their walk just picking up some litter as they went. And that made me think, because when I take my dog for a walk, I might see litter on the ground and go, oh, terrible, people leaving litter there. But I walk on past it. So what reading that panel made me think is, it's using your word of ownership. Why don't I take some ownership of that? Why don't I start taking a plastic bag out with me and putting some litter in it every day? The ownership of heating, for example, and radiator valves. So I think there are so many ways we can take ownership. And for me, it took reading that panel. Now, the last 3 days since I read that panel, every time I've gone out, I've got halfway around my walk and think, oh, I didn't have to bring a plastic bag with me. So it will take some time, but that gives me hope, I think, because it doesn't solve the big question. But I think so many people do want to do the right thing. But for me, it took reading this panel to open my eyes to doing the right thing for this one small problem.
Lindsey, did you have any comments you wanted to share on what you've heard before we open up more broadly? You're muted.
Sorry. I want to uphold the message that there are many angles to this. There isn't a silver bullet, to use the wrong image for Quakers, but there isn't just one way. And we all have a contribution to make, and none of us can solve this alone. So putting that despair on the side and then saying, what can I do today? As our friend said about taking the bag with him on and actually doing something that he was thinking about, but now doing it. But it's a mix, and this sense of personal witness, this sense of political action, this sense of also having a vision that we pass to our neighbors and our children, because our children need not just our hope, they need our action. So that's what I would give to you. What are the legacies we're leaving, and how are we a piece of that puzzle? And we're all passing the beacon of light to the next generations. Thank you.
I'll open it now to any questions that we have. Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, just following up from what Alistair was saying. I mean, one of the problems that I find talking to people about climate change is that they get very negative views. They're going to say, well, I suppose you're going to tell me I've got to stop flying and I've got to stop driving and I've got to do this. And my answer is rather like George Fox's answer, that you fly as long as you can. Now that may sound a bit odd, but in fact, what it means is that if you do plan to fly somewhere, you've got to stop and think, is it important? I mean, it might be to see your grandchild or something that you haven't seen before. In that case, I would say maybe it is important and you need to do it. But if you're just flying off for a weekend in Spain or something like that, then I would say maybe that isn't. So I think people get a lot of guilty conscience when they're flying, but they feel guilty because they really feel that it's not really what they should be doing. And I think what we're saying is that you should go through some sort of process of discernment about, trying to think really more deeply about what is it I'm doing and is it worth it? What do I get out of it? What is it going to cost and so on? And I think if people went through that process, I think which is something Quakers can offer, then I think that people would feel a lot. They may come out of it and say, well, yes, it is important, and I'll go, and therefore they don't have this guilty conscience thing, I think.
Matt, can we invite anyone on Zoom to share a question, or are there themes coming back up on the chat?
Yeah, Jenny had a question. Do you want to share that, Jenny, or I can read it?
Would you read it, please?
Sure, of
Thank
course.
you.
Jenny says, I worry about the polarization across all levels of society, across the whole of the world. As a Quaker, I see the oneness of all life, but how do we make connections to bring everyone together when there seems to be an overwhelming force to create divisions?
Anyone like to pick up and respond to that?
That was exactly what I was saying. Yeah, and I struggle with it, and I work on equalities and work to bring communities together and even policymakers to be more fair and more just in the way they look at their strategies, engagement. It is a big struggle because you do have this whole divide, and I feel that the divide is getting bigger and bigger, just like you, Jenny, like you said, that we are becoming more polarized communities. But I suppose it's for us all to start talking to one another, connecting to one another, and actually not listening to the media as well. I think, like, how do we switch off from the media that gives us all these negative narratives is really important, and start building positive narratives between people.
I don't, it's a great question and I don't know the answer, but one thing that gives me hope actually around these connections is technology. So I was browsing iPlayer the other day and I caught something that's 50 degrees, surviving in 50 degrees. And it was about Karachi in Pakistan, where they're getting 50-degree temperatures. And it was a brilliant 20-minute story about a young man who worked repairing air conditioning systems and his mother's battle to repair a water tank. And he worked as hard as he could to get enough money for that. And the other guy they profiled was trying to set up urban forests to help cool Karachi. And without being in Karachi, I felt I was actually there and understanding perspectives and much richer through imagining what that is like for people. And Teams, when it works seamlessly, can do the same thing, or Zoom can. So I think the ability to make connections with people around the world without necessarily having to fly and do that can give us much greater empathy of situations around the world, and maybe can give us a little bit of the answer to that question. But I think it's a great question, and just one thought on how technology might be able to help.
Any other responses to that, or other questions or comments that have come up today?
Could I just come in on, I was just in the States. I was on a plane flying to see my 97-year-old mother. One of the things that struck me was when her neighbor said, well, the other side says this. The polarization in the States, the polarization we see here. And I'm reminded that historically dividing society is used to push through political desires, that we are often manipulated to see each other as different. And we're in a time where we have to kind of take the log out of our eye as well, to listen and to see, to recognize those spaces of things we both cherish, to think of the language that we can use to reach to the next person. It may not be the language we would use, but it would be the language. And I also want to add that there is a very strong movement, Quakers in Britain, in terms of this COP, which is for loss and damage, which is for the people already affected by climate change, no matter what happens. And this is connected to something called polluters pay. So while our individual actions are critical, we cannot turn a blind eye to those who are making money from extraction and often very much feeding the push for individual change because they do not want to be upheld, such as oil companies, etc., for what they're doing, and to look at things like aviation tax, to look at things like carbon tax, which is redistributed to support the most vulnerable, international efforts, Tobin tax. There is so much we could be doing that's transformational, that actually focuses on who's making money from these lucrative activities. So it's that side we need to also really question. And just to leave you with a smile, Norway, which is the largest oil extractor in Europe and also seen as very much a human rights champion, is being taken to court by its youth right now. And they are fighting in the Human Rights Council a recognition of the right to a healthy environment, when normally they would be behind it because they themselves are being sued by their own youth for not reducing their extraction. So there is a whole other side going on here, and we can learn from our period of abolition of slavery. We can learn from this. What can we learn from history, and how can we engage now to also hold each other, but to hold those who are benefiting accountable? Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsey. I can only apologise for the abstract image we have on the screen, but hopefully you can hear everything okay. And we're going to take a comment from the room here.
Mary Alice. We're all little people, and we all can do little things. And one little thing that one can do if one's walking a dog and there's litter around, you probably have poo bags in your pocket. Use your poo bag, flatten the tins, and a poo bag will take a certain number of bottles. That's what we did for years, and eventually you start remembering to put a bigger bag in your pocket before you go out with the dog. And the neighbours think that maybe you go to the woods to consume your bottles of bucket.
Maybe I do as well.
Matt, how are we doing on the Zoom? Any more questions we can bring in?
Yeah, we've got a comment from Stuart. Would you like to ask that, Stuart, or I can read it as well?
I'd be happy for you to read that.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and read it. Stuart says, "This has been very interesting. When we need to look back, we also have to look forward. We have to acknowledge where we are now. I often feel that we, especially in the environmental and Quaker communities, hark back to a past that was better, a time when we lived more rurally and more in our communities. But for the future, I believe we need to move people to cities. These are the most carbon efficient places. We need less land to support people in cities than we do to maintain them in rural environments. Can it be that we need more clearances? We need to move people from the land to the urban environment. We need to have hyper-efficient farms to feed these cities. And we have to return land to be wild places by reducing the area that we farm. We must make cities wonderful, vibrant places of culture and community. I feel that modernity is part of the solution."
It's a question of which is the most carbon efficient way versus which is the one that protects the earth the best. Can those two work in harmony? Alistair, how do you want to contribute?
Yes, I mean, I'm very deaf, and I was just picking up some of that from the caption, but I think the speaker was suggesting we need to move into cities and live in hyper-efficient ways.
With hyper-efficient farms and
Hyper-efficient farms and all this, and leave nature just to wildness. Well, the problem that I have with that eco-modernist approach, as it's often called, is that I believe it actually alienates us from nature. I believe it turns us into, Le Corbusier, the French architect of brutalist architecture, spoke about buildings as being machines for living. And I think that understanding of buildings and cities as machines for living in actually alienates us from our community. So I am not a supporter of that kind of eco-modernism. I am a supporter of we are stardust, we are golden, and we've got to make it back to the garden. I'm a supporter of reconnecting with the soil underneath our fingers and being immersed in nature. The criticism of that, however, is how do you do that in a world of 8 billion people, probably going to plateau at around 11 billion. And this is where I think it's crucial that we understand that climate change emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are a combination of our population multiplied by our consumption. I was born in 1955. In my lifetime alone, world population has increased 3 times, and carbon dioxide emissions from consumption have increased 6 times. In other words, our consumerism as a whole has been double the problem of population growth. But it is both of these factors combined. Therefore, I do not support population control. I do not support population control in that sense of authoritarian telling people what they must do. But I do very strongly support the view that world population needs to come down, and even more so, our level of greenhouse gas emitting consumption needs to come down. How can world population come down without some kind of authoritarian control? The answer is very simple. But whereas the political right wing has seized hold of population control and said there are too many Indians and Arabs, therefore we must sterilize them or throw contraceptives at them or whatever, in actual fact, the evidence shows that fertility rates fall naturally and very rapidly. You know, Ireland now has a fertility rate of just 2, slightly less than the replacement rate. Brazil is 1.7. Portugal, a Catholic country, 1.2. Only 1.2 children per family in Portugal. And also in, I think it's Moldavia, just on the fringe of the former Soviet Union. How does that happen? It happens when two principal characteristics are in place. First of all, when women are free, when women are educated, when they have the vote, when they have economic opportunity. They don't choose to have large families. They choose to have 1 or 2 children, generally speaking. And secondly, when there is social justice, when families no longer feel the need to have large families in order to secure themselves in old age. That's what's been bringing fertility rates down in many countries in the world now. Those two things falling into place. Those are not an agenda that the political right likes. And I ask myself, why has the political left not embraced it more? I think it's kind of swallowed the narrative from the right, and it's failed to look on population as an opportunity for social justice and women's emancipation. And then secondly, consumption levels. The more empty we are inside, the more, as an English rock star put it, I can't get no satisfaction because I try and I try and I try. We're always trying to fill that emptiness. And folks, this is what Quakers can offer and other people, other groups of faith can offer. Because real satisfaction comes from within. Real satisfaction comes from love in our relationships. These are spiritual things. And in my view, what we can most do as a religious society of friends is open up these understandings of where real satisfaction comes from. So we undercut that need for more and more consumption. We make ourselves immune to the blandishments of capitalism, and therefore capitalism withers on its own branch because we're no longer fertilizing it. And at the same time, as we create a socially just society, and a society in which women and men are of equality, the evidence from across the world suggests that population will start to fall. And as that happens, we can relax more easily into the natural environment. We don't all have to cram into cities and live in Le Corbusier type high-rise blocks, no matter how modern they can be. We can relax back into nature and into our human nature. That would be my vision.
I have an eye on the time, that we are very close to the end, but I don't want to stem a response if any of our speakers have a quick.
Just to add to that, I totally agree with Alistair there. I'm just worried that if we go down that path, we're just going to become farmed humans, just like we have farmed cattle and we have farmed fishing. We're just going to become farmed humans. But for me, I work with a lot of migrant communities, and one of the things that I hear again and again is the connection to their land. And that's not a city, that's not a town, it's not an infrastructure, it's actually the land, the soil. And it was actually Azim's here as one of his community members that I was with one day, and she said, what she really misses is actually touching the ground, putting the soil through her hands and feeling the warmth of that soil. That's her home country, right? And for me, I think we have to be connected to our natural environment. If we're not, we're just exploiting it, we're extracting from it, we're not giving it back. Yeah, so I totally agree.
It was so interesting, Zarina. When I've been up in the Highlands of summer, I spent quite a lot of time there. I saw more people of colour, especially of Asian ethnic origin, having holidays in the Highlands than I've ever seen before. And they just looked so happy.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been working on and with other people as well is this whole idea of identity and belonging. When migrants come to a different country, it's really, really important for them to be connected to their natural environment. If they aren't, they don't feel like citizens. If you don't feel like citizens, then how can you have conversations around being responsible citizens? So for me, it's like, let's tackle the root cause of citizenship, about communities, where we belong, who we are, and what we're proud.
It is past now, and I know Linda wants to wrap up, so
just one comment on the question. So the one bit of the question that resonated with me was this mix of some people looking back and wanting to go back to how things were in a more rural past. And if you think about films that are set in the future, Blade Runner or films like this, they're nearly all set in cities and they're quite dark. And neither of those are right. We can't go back with the number of people we have on the planet to live like we did 100 years ago. I don't think we can go forward and just live in cities in the way Blade Runner depicts, or have everyone in cities. It's about finding a new way. And for me, there's probably not enough exploration of what that new way might be that gets that balance between cities and connection with the land.
I wonder if our friend who asked that question wants to come back on it, because we've sort of disagreed with the question. So I wonder if there's space to ask our friend what they think about our responses.
I hope people can hang out for a few more minutes so we're able to do that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk. I mean, I feel that this sort of nirvana of people getting back into the rural world. Can you imagine what the world would look like if we all had a small section of land of our own? I think it's a very, it's a wonderful idea, but I don't think it's a practical idea. I'm sorry, I don't know the names of the speakers. I've missed that, the connection with the people at the beginning. So, but the gentleman in the grey sweater, yeah, what is the modern alternative to how we to living this life? That's a very good question, I think, because for me, you can't go back to this everyone touching the earth. There's not enough space. We've actually got to make space for some of the wild things. And we keep on taking away from the wild things. And so how do we make space for that while we wait for the population to plateau at 11 billion? I mean, 20 years ago, we used to say the population would plateau at 7 billion. We're past it. And it's not plateauing. And now I'm hearing 11 billion. I thought it was 9 billion, but we're going to plateau at 3 years ago. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know the answer. I just don't think that you can necessarily feel that we need to find other solutions and new solutions for this world that we live in. That's what I think is. I think that's a good observation. Thank you. But it was very interesting. So thank you very much to all the speakers.
I think we're going to pass to Linda to.
I mean, that sounds like the perfect place to stop, really. And I think it's. I mean, I'm increasingly seeing this project as a kind of steps on a journey, really. I mean, we're seeing lots of different people all on their journey, and all of us have got lots of different dimensions to that journey. And it's wonderful to hear. I mean, I've experienced, like John was saying, I've picked up ideas from people making panels, and as Alistair was saying, we need to do what we can when we can, and not what we can't do. You know, so and I think part of what we can do is imagine that future together. We have to imagine it together. It's a process. Nobody knows all of it. And do what we can do and not what we can't. And also telling people about what we're doing and why we're doing it, why we're making that change, why I'm picking up putting the stuff in my doggy bag, or not making the journey, or whatever it is. So thank you so much, all of you, for your contributions today. It steps on a journey for each of us, but it's also, this is one step on a journey for the Loving Earth project itself. It's our first event in Glasgow. We've got 2 other events in the area at the moment. We've got at the Merryhill Borough Halls, we've got a little exhibition that's opened, and tomorrow there's one opening at the Scottish Maritime Museum in Dumbarton. And if anyone's going to Ayr or to Tayport in the next couple of days, there's some displays there. And we're hoping to have more displays. We've got 300 panels at the moment. So we're still looking for more places to share them around Glasgow over the next couple of months, when lots of people from around the world will be coming. It's been wonderful to have panels from Uganda, from Oregon, from France, from Slovenia, some of which were talked about today. It's not obvious where they all come from. And then after that, we're hoping to, or we're intending to display panels for a couple of years after that. Not all together, there's too many altogether, but they can go to different places and different groups. And we're now thinking about the future of what will happen to the panels in the end. And I think that's an interesting thing as well. One of the things that we can do to break down this commodification and so on is gifts. I've been really very generously hosted by friends in Glasgow. It's a gift. All these panels have been handed over by people to whom they're very precious and have invested a lot of time. That's a gift. And I think the more we can sort of do that gift, giving food, wherever I go, people give food, don't we? That's a wonderful thing. So just thank you very much, all of you. If you want to know what's happening to the future of this project, we've got a mailing list, we've got a website. Perhaps that can, I'm sure everyone must know that if you're here. We look forward to hearing more from many people in the future. It can be developed in many, many different ways. So use the resources, go where the spirit leads. And thank you very much to Glasgow Friends for hosting us today, especially to Martin and Mary Alice, who's disappeared, and to Gisela and John, who've been putting these things up and organising things at this end, and to our speakers. Thank you.
I'd just like to extend the thanks to our speakers and Glasgow meeting and all of you for coming. We hope to have another event like this on the 3rd of November in the evening, which will be during COP time, and we hope to get a bit more of an international set of speakers for that. But thank you very much for coming, and safe journey homes, and especially even if it's just your kitchen now from your living room.
And thank you to you.
And thank you, of course, to Linda, who keeps this whole show on the road.